Hi, I'm Greg, welcome to Affect Studio, and welcome to the fourth installment of my expose into liquid profiling, where I test the tone controls and suggest there may be another way to utilize the models to get an even better result. I'll get to that. First off, I want to explain and demonstrate the way the new amp models are incorporated into the profiles. There seems to be a bit of confusion around this, particularly when working out what to do if the amp you have isn't on their list of models. There was also some concern that Kemper has now reduced itself to being a modeler. This should clear that up. To demonstrate, I have a profile done a couple of years ago of my Tweed Champ style amp on 12 running into my Marshall quad. There's no EQ on a Champ, of course, just volume. So here's the same profile, except I retrofitted it with an orange overdrive EQ. And back to the original profile. So you heard the tone change? No? Good. That's because the model isn't being used yet. Until I actually adjust the controls, they aren't actually doing anything to the profile. Now if I make some adjustments, you will hear a tone change. So back to the orange. Notice how it now sounds like an orange? Well, a little bit maybe, but not really. This is because it's only using the model of the tone stack to shape the tone. It isn't adding any other characteristics of an orange to the profile. The core tone is still the profile of the Champ into the quad. The new models aren't actually any different to the generic EQ in the sense that all they're doing is allowing you to shape the overall sound of the profile. The big improvement is we now have tone controls that behave like specific amps. When you set the tone controls to the middle on both your amp and the profiler to make a liquid profile, you are just giving the profiler a known reference point for them to work from. The values entered as part of profiling or retrofitting an existing profile don't matter until you make a change. It's like synchronizing watches in old war movies. Synchronize tone controls, everything on 5, ready, go. All we are doing is ensuring it has the same range of tone shaping the original amp has. It also doesn't seem to matter if you retrofit the liquid model or add it from the start. The only thing with retrofitting an existing profile is the tone control positions won't match exactly unless you know how the amp was set when it was profiled. So 7 on your amp's base matches 7 on the profile's base control. That way they work over the same range and therefore behave like the original amp. As far as I can tell, the actual profiling hasn't changed at all. Making a new liquid profile doesn't sound any different to retrofitting an existing one. It's the control of it afterwards that has improved enormously. I think it actually may sound better adding it to an existing profile or one made the way we used to. Before we get to that, let me demonstrate the way it sets the reference tone controls to whatever utility you've used. For this one, I retrofitted the 5150 model, but as you can see, told it the tone controls on the Champ, which we know don't exist, are on some wacky settings. So does that mess up the tone? And back to the reference original profile. Still sounds the same. Next I retrofitted the Roland Jazz Chorus model into the profile, except told it all the tone controls are on 0. Once again, absolutely no change in tone because I haven't adjusted the tone controls from the initial settings burnt into the profile. Telling it how my amp was set and burning those settings into an existing profile is basically the equivalent of unscrewing the virtual knobs on the Kemper, and putting them back to match the values my amp was set on. Until I move the controls, no change is occurring, even though the values on the knobs are no longer in the middle. Now if I'd actually profiled the amp with settings like we just saw and burnt them into the Kemper profile, moving them to something usable would still allow it to work and sound like the real amp, because the amp and the profiler were set the same. I'll show you. I've made liquid profiles with various settings on the actual amp's volume and tone controls and entered those values into the Kemper as part of the profiling so it will all match up. I will then match all settings in the Kemper so we can hear how the Kemper's tone controls compare to the real thing. To start, I made a cleanish profile of my deluxe reverb style amp, The amp was set with the volume on 2.5, bass on 3 and treble on 6. You can see the same settings on the Kemper. I'll match the other profiles to the generic gain value shown on the right. The profiler isn't shaping the tone at all yet because I haven't made any adjustments to those settings. As far as the profiler is concerned, at the moment, this is no different to a generic profile with the EQ flat. This is our reference for checking the new tone control models. Now here is a profile I made with the exact same settings on the amp, except the volume's on 10 as they tell you to do, making a proper liquid profile. Back to the reference. So not exactly the same, but very close. I think the original reference one still sounds a little richer, but it shows you how well the new gain changing part of liquid profiling works. That is just so close from a profile made with the controls on full. So for the next one, I kept the volume on 10, but turned the bass and treble controls up to 10 as well. I entered those settings into the profile when making the profile so the control references match still. So this way we can hear how all the tone controls work. Back to the original. So really close, not exactly the same either, and that was obviously a quite large change in the tone controls, going from full down to the 3 and 6. Now for the next one I went the other way and made a profile with the gain on full still, with the bass and treble controls all the way down, which is 1 on a Fender. I believe this is the closest the Fender circuit gets to being flat. So I'll really hear what the modelled tone controls are doing here. Back to the reference. So I'm hearing a much bigger change there, which is not surprising because actually they're being boosted quite significantly. Still sounds really good, just not quite as rich as the original amp. For the last one I made a proper liquid profile the way Kemper instruct. So the volume was on 10 and the tone controls were halfway up, which in this case being a Fender style amp is 5.5. Once again obviously I've matched the profile to the settings of the reference amp. Back to the reference amp. Then the one I did with the same tone settings as the reference amp except volume up. Back to the reference amp. And then the proper liquid profile again. So much closer to the original than the last two, which would be because it's using a lot less of the modelled tone controls. Still seem to lose something overall and be a tiny bit harsher than the original two though. Now this leads me to suggesting there is a better way to use liquid profiling, so we are still using our amp's actual tone controls to shape the sound for the majority of it. Particularly relevant for anybody who has an amp not on the list, and even more so if it isn't on the list and there isn't a model that's similar to your amp. I'm suggesting we continue making profiles with the tone settings on our amp as we like them, as I did with the first two profiles of the Deluxe. Retrofitting to an existing profile will be the same. This way we only actually need to use liquid models when we want to alter the core profile tone. Unlike Kemper's way, which means you are using the modelled tone shaping all the time, except when everything is in the middle position. Now I went with a Kemper because I love my amps and I could still use them by making profiles. I don't like modelers that much, so why would I want to use a modelled tone control when I can use my own amp's tone controls to shape the core profiled sound as I always have? Now, as we've just heard, the liquid modelled amps are very impressive, and I have no problem using them and will be using them, but think this should give us even better results. What I'm suggesting is basically the same as we did with a generic EQ, except the tone controls we used, the modelled tone controls, now reflect the amp settings and work like the ones on an amp. It's not actually that different to what Kemper planned either. It's just that we're synchronising the controls to our preferred amp settings. So making changes on the Kemper will still work the same, we're just relying less on the modelled tone controls and using more of the real thing to shape the basic tone. So here's an example going back to the profiles of my deluxe reverb type amp. I set up the first two profiles with similar settings to what I normally use. By profiling on full, I have the benefit of the liquid gain change working like an amp, which to me is the most significant improvement with liquid profiling. Being able to change the amount of drive without changing the overall tone makes a profiler so much closer to a real amp. The tone models are a bonus. Hopefully, by making a full volume liquid profile at my preferred settings, it's also generated a profile based on a better sounding distortion. By entering the values that I chose, either from the start or by retrofitting a model, the Kemper still has an accurate reference point to work from, so we get all the benefits of the realistic tone controls when we do use them. So if I get to a gig and find the original settings were right, I'm not needing the Kemper model at all. If I do need to make some adjustments, I'm probably only using a little bit of the modelled tone controls. The sound shaping is still primarily done by my amp from the initial profile. It makes sense to me anyway. So whether or not the sound was better on the first two profiles, where all the tone shaping was from the amp, they definitely sounded the same as the mic'd amp I profiled. So let's see if they keep those characteristics with some slight tone changes, so all of them are using the liquid model, just different percentages of it. So first up I have the same reference profile we were using, except I've moved the bass control from 3 to 2.5 and the treble from 6 to 7.5. Now this one is the full volume liquid profile made the way Kemper instruct, obviously matched in their same settings. Okay, that one definitely sounds harsher to me. Now this is the one I did with the full volume on the same settings as the other one, so the amp was actually shaping a tone before this. That sounds much closer to me. So back to the original one again. Then to the proper liquid profile version. Yeah, definitely grittier and dirtier. And then the one where I just turned down the volume, but it's the same tone on the amp. The original modified. No question liquid tone profiling works really well, but I think it's pretty safe to say there that the liquid profile, the full profile done the way they say, was the one that, you know, was certainly grittier and seemed harsher than the other two. Now the original low volume profile, even with the tone controls moved, to me still had a richer sound, where the second one was slightly brighter. It wasn't quite the same, had a slight bit more grit to it, but still sounded to me a bit more natural. So I think, as I say, I'll be doing most of my profiles with, you know, setting the amp the way I like it and then telling the Kemper what those settings are, rather than putting the tone controls all in the middle and using the tone controls, the modelled tone controls, to actually shape the tone. I'll start by shaping it myself and tell it what it's done, so it still syncs up, which is still a fantastic outcome. And as I say, I think actually it's a better way to do it, and I think the results are there. Anyway, so hopefully that clears up some of the confusion and helps you get even more out of it. Whatever model you choose, the sound is still the profile of the amp, same as the generic EQ. The tone controls don't do anything until you use them. If you listen to the end of my third liquid profiling video, you get an idea of the sort of changes the models make. The tone controls in most amps are based on a similar topology, so there isn't a big difference between most of them in what they actually do. And you can mix the models with other amps anyway. I've been trying a profile of my Marshall Astoria with the model of a dual rectifier, which gives me more effective tone shaping, and I'm liking the profile now more than I did before. So as always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please invite your friends along, and hopefully I'll see you soon.